the way we use Xiaoyuan for stress really comes out of that early 20th century moment. We want to expand our clinical repertoire because there's other things that I think we need to be thinking about. And constraint is this really complicated idea that has so many permutations and different presentations, so that we want to recognize, so that we may have a limited view of it. But I think you're right. This idea of stress, which is, again, it's the most nondescript sort of term out there. I don't know what it means clinically, but it becomes a kind of catch-all, I think, a little bit like neurasthenia did. And so our first thought, it goes right to Xiaoyuan and liver qi constraint.
Hi, Michael Max here, and this is Qiological. Outrage is the new drug. It's available on the 24/7 news feed. You can get a dose in your favorite distraction machine chat group. Our increasingly polarized and interconnected world seems to serve it up at every turn. You might find it in your practice as well. That patient that no-shows or doesn't take their herbs, or, I like this one, finally listens to their OBGYN when they say don't eat sugar after you've been telling them to do that for months. There are so many moments in a day when we get angry or frustrated because others don't see things the way that we do. But really, these are all moments to practice one of the most difficult things for a human being, to practice some empathy. Empathy is hard. You probably heard me here on the podcast mention Seth Godin. I started reading his stuff years ago, trying to understand something about marketing because, frankly, he doesn't sound like a marketing guy. He's a keen observer of human nature, how we connect, and maybe more importantly, how we don't. Empathy isn't particularly difficult for those with whom we feel a sense of kinship, but it's another story altogether when we look to extend empathy to those that we seek to serve or understand, but hold a vastly different point of view. Here are a few questions. They're powerful questions that I got from Uncle Seth that can help you to extend your empathy beyond its usual bounds. 3 questions. What do they see that I don't see? What do they want that I don't want? And this one's great, what do they believe that I don't believe? Take a moment and consider these questions with, say, the people enrolled in Weight Watchers, or the people that exercise compulsively or not at all, or those who think that pharmaceutical medication actually makes them healthier, or those who spend more money and thought on their dog's health care than their own. And here's one that'll test your Buddha nature: those who live on the other side of the political spectrum. The trick here is not to use pejorative language in your thinking, but rather positive language. Can you actually get the positive intent in their point of view? If you find this little exercise to be difficult, then you're doing it right. Empathy is hard. It's hard because it requires that you find a place in yourself that can understand other people without having to agree with them, so that for a moment you can see and feel their experience without your usual storyline, beliefs, and judgments. And oh man, do I know I have those. A lot of people think empathy and tolerance are similar, but I suspect that empathy is actually the polar opposite of tolerance. Tolerance requires a stance of strength. It's really yang when you think about it. Empathy, on the other hand, unfolds with a softness. It's yin. It comes from yielding. Not the kind of yielding of weakness, but the yielding of being rooted, stable enough in yourself that you can see and understand someone else from their own point of view, right? So for a moment to stop selling yourself on yourself and your beliefs and listen for understanding. Understanding from a perspective and a stance that for you is a foreign country. Empathy is hard. And I suspect it's a worthwhile practice. And you'll fail all the time. I still think it's worth cultivating. And if you need some help with this, go visit Uncle Seth over at www.seth.blog. You might learn a thing or two about marketing in the process. All right. I've got a quick housekeeping thing here, and then we're going to get into today's conversation on qi constraint, something you'll no doubt run into on the way to being more fluent with a sense of empathy. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. All the sponsors here provide helpful products or services that you'll find beneficial in your clinical work. Want to get better at treating concussions and other neurological conditions? Clayton Shu has some innovative methods. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. Later in the show, Jane offers you helpful suggestions on how to raise your rates, and Golden Flower Chinese Herbs shares a journey of healing that I think you'll recognize. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Geological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients, and then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more. Ever found yourself listening to a geological conversation and thinking, wow, I needed to hear that? Yeah, me too. And I never know when I'm going to hear a guest say something that stops my world and reboots it with a larger perspective. If these conversations have ever helped you to feel more grounded, more inspired, or just less alone in this strange and wonderful work we do, consider becoming a member or supporting the podcast with a bit of tithing to the donation jar. It helps keep the lights on here at the Geological Sound and Motion Lab so that we can bring you these conversations every Tuesday morning. You'll find all the details at geological.com. Thanks for listening and for being a part of this.
Hey there, I'm Cameron Jafari, an acupuncturist from Los Angeles. So I started learning nanopuncture from Dr. Clayton Shu because I was facing these complex neurological conditions like stroke and MS in my clinic, and I just felt like I lacked a solid process to treat them. Brain-related issues always felt like a whole different animal, and I was looking for a clinical system that worked and could guide me through them. So after attending my first nanopuncture seminar, I was able to apply the process pretty quickly and with pretty amazing results. I remember the first stroke patient I saw afterwards was a guy who had had a stroke 2 years back, and he couldn't talk at all. And after a few treatments, he started saying a few words. And a few treatments after that, he could actually have conversations. It was pretty incredible. So this is why I feel like nanopuncture is the future of acupuncture neurology. And you can be a part of that. Their next seminar is on treating concussions and is being co-taught by both Dr. Shu and Dr. Ayla Wolf in New York City on April 26th and 27th. To learn more, visit nanopunctureseminars.com.
My guest today is Eric Karchmer. Eric is a Chinese medicine practitioner and assistant professor of anthropology at Appalachian State University. He studied Chinese medicine at the Zhongyao Daxue, that's the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine, and he graduated with a BA in medicine in the year 2000. By the way, a BA from that school, it's like a couple steps above the MAs that we get here in the States. It's no small thing. In addition to practicing and teaching, Eric has an interest in medical anthropology, science studies, the politics and knowledge, Chinese medicine, Chinese studies, colonial and post-colonial societies, and ethnobiology. What's more, he's published articles with titles like The Excitations and Suppressions of Time, Locating Emotional Disturbances in Modern Chinese Medicine, as well as Slow Medicine, How Chinese Medicine Became Efficacious Only for Chronic Conditions. I'm telling you, he's a geeky dude. Today, we're sitting down for a little conversation about something that y'all think is one of the garden variety diagnoses of Chinese medicine, liver qi constraint. Guess what? It's a fairly recent idea. So buckle up, hold on to your worldview. Things are going to get a little woogity in here. Eric, welcome to Geological.
Thank you, Michael. It's my pleasure to be here.
I want to start out. I've got a question here. How does a guy who teaches in Appalachia, a guy who works at a place called Boone Healing Arts, find himself in China studying medicine? I don't think you were there looking for the ultimate jiaozi.
Well, I started in China first, and so I came to Appalachia later. I spent many years living in China, kind of starting in the late 80s. I took a break in the early 90s. Got interested in anthropology and went to study for a PhD in anthropology at UNC Chapel Hill.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the mid 90s, I went back to do my PhD research, and one thing led to another. And I ended up sort of getting that BA, as you mentioned, in Chinese medicine at the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine. That led to a lot of things and a clinical practice and more research, and eventually ended up also teaching anthropology here at Appalachian State University.
So anthropology came first, and then the medicine came a little later.
That's right. I started studying anthropology. This might sound a little silly to your viewers, but maybe it was the times, or maybe it was just my own background. But the idea of studying Chinese medicine just seemed impossible to me. I didn't know who did it. I never imagined. I didn't really know about schools here in the U.S. It was something that intrigued me, but I also had this interest in China first. So I became kind of fascinated with Chinese society and kind of venture into Chinese medicine.
You've got this really vast background. I'm curious to know, what was that first thing that really kind of caught your attention and made you go China? What drew you to that place? What drew you to that culture?
Well, like a lot of things in my career, I kind of backed into it. I was just looking for a way to avoid going. I was pre-med in college, and I was just looking for a way to avoid medical school, which is I kind of was, which I felt I sort of had said I was going to do that, and I think maybe my parents expected that. I don't know, but I just wanted something different than what I've been doing in college, and I got a chance to teach English in China, and that changed everything.
Yeah, you took that chance. That's great.
Before that, I'd never studied Chinese language. I couldn't have been more ignorant about China, never mind Chinese medicine.
Yeah. So you learned your Chinese over there, I suspect.
I did. So I went there, and again, I had to, I mean, never would have imagined learning Chinese, except that I kind of had to at that time. Very few people spoke English, and I started studying. And that actually was I was kind of through the language that I became, really fascinated in China. Once I was able to speak, suddenly, like, this whole world opened up to me. And that led to the anthropology, and then ultimately to the Chinese medicine.
And ultimately to the medicine. It's such a unique combination to have that deep, very deep cultural view into the place and into the people and into the history, and then to be able to take and overlay the medicine with it.
Well, it's been a journey, but it's always been a fascinating one. So I feel fortunate, and it's, like I said, I backed into it, but it worked out in some ways very nicely. If I'd ever planned to do it, I don't even know how I would have done it.
How many of us actually plan the lives that we have? Mm-hmm. I think very few. Most of us, it comes from the periphery. We back into it. We get a lucky break that at the time seemed like a disaster. Something like that.
Yeah. I mean, it was really like that. I mean, even to study Chinese medicine the way I did, I mean, that was definitely not allowed, in my PhD program, but it was tolerated, I guess, because I came back to finish the PhD when I finished the Chinese medicine studies. If you were to try to do that in grad school now, I think you just get kicked out. I almost got kicked out, but I didn't.
Well, I love it how, the Chinese language is so expressive. They say things like, 是不可能的, right? That's impossible.
Yeah.
Which means keep negotiating. But if they say, oh, 对不起, 不方便, I'm sorry, that's inconvenient, forget it, you're screwed.
One thing that's been really special about learning Chinese medicine in Chinese was the language. And it's so rich. And I suspect a lot of that is lost in translation. And then being able and getting, I was a reasonably good conversationalist when I started, but I really wasn't great at reading or writing Chinese. And so I had to get up to speed in that. But that also opened like all these doors to all this literature that's available in China. It's, that was special.
Right. You get access to the literature, and you get access to the nuance, which is something else. So let's dive into this topic here, liver-qi constraint. You sent me an article about this recently that was really eye-opening. So for our listeners that haven't had a chance to read the article, actually, would it be possible to put a copy of it up on the website so they can go get it?
Absolutely, and it's available through open access, so that they could. I think what we'd have to do is a link. We'd have a link, but it's available through open access. And actually, it's published together with 3 other papers. It was part of a collective research project. So for people who are interested in the topic, they also really want to look at the other papers, because I was working at the time with Volker Scheid, who some of your listeners may know. And I was also working with Soo-Young Soo, who's a scholar of Korean medicine, and Keiko Daidiji, who's a scholar of Japanese medicine. And we all wrote about constraint and its sort of different meanings and valences in Korea, Japan, and China. And Volker took a much sort of earlier look at its meanings in kind of late imperial times. So all those papers really go nicely together, and they're it'll really give you a full picture of the meaning of that term.
Terrific. It'll be up there on qiological.com. Just look for the show notes page for this. So, Eric, talk to us about constraint. Where does this idea come from?
Well, it's an old term, and it's there in the inner canon. It goes through some different permutations, and the paper by Volker Scheid will, if I remember correctly, looks at sort of like what happens to it sort of in the post-Song era. My particular paper looks at the term and the way it changes in the early 20th century China. And so one thing I think probably most of your listeners aren't aware of is just how much Chinese medicine has evolved and changed. And I'd argue even been through a couple of revolutions over its sort of 2,000 years plus of history and practice. And certainly one important change was in the early 20th century. That's the part I know the best. This idea of sort of liver qi constraint is something that it's not born in the 20th century. It's a late imperial idea, but it's very different than the idea of constraint that you would find in another formula that your listeners might be aware of, which is the Judanxi formula, Yuejuwan, which is an escape restraint pill, maybe, I believe is how it's
I think that's it.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that's confusing is I think that a lot of writing on that particular formula, for instance, is then written through the idea of liver qi constraint, because it does have shangfu in that formula. And so people then will try to make that formula primarily about liver qi constraint, and then dealing with, I think it's the 6 other types of constraint, food, phlegm, fire, dampness. And we'll argue that it starts with liver qi constraint. And this is where Volker's article will be very helpful here. But if you look at the formula, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of that formula. I think it's really talking about maybe constraint in the middle burner. It's a very different idea of constraint, frankly. And when you get to the 20th century, and this is sort of what I argued in my paper, some really interesting things start to happen. A lot of scholars, some of the sort of more famous scholars that we know of, I think we might think of them as the Convergence School, folks who were practitioners of Chinese medicine, but who also had a pretty strong foundation in Western medicine. They start sort of pulling in some ideas from Western medicine, and then constraint becomes something that's like quintessentially in the liver for these folks. That's not, they didn't totally invent that, but I think they made it a thing.
They sort of popularized it?
They popularized it, and the way they justified it is super interesting. And so this is what I talk about in my paper. The argument that they made, it's an argument that would be, by today's terms, almost laughable, but they argued that, but I think it's the basis for the way that like formulas like Xiaoyao and rambling powder, get used today. They argued that the liver in Chinese medicine is analogous to the nervous system.
Now, where did they get this idea? I remember in school we were thinking nervous system. They kind of threw that in with the kidneys in modern TCM.
Oh, really? Okay. I think a couple of things. One, I don't know about your schooling, but, in my training, just teachers did not want their students to be assuming sort of these correspondences between Western medicine and Chinese medicine. We were sort of taught that the Chinese medicine body is its own thing. It's, for example, we often say it's functional, whereas in Western medicine, we might say it's about structure. That's a dichotomy that I think is problematic too. But that also begins to emerge during this time period. But for the Republican period doctors, they didn't really have these misgivings about sort of conflating the two bodies or using bits of anatomy and Western medicine to correct what they thought were mistakes in Chinese medicine, or to correct mistakes. I think that'd be the best way of putting it. The nervous system also is kind of a new thing in the early 20th century. So that's also part of it. And one kind of aspect of what made it, so I think there was a, now I'm a little rough on the details here, but I think that there was like a Nobel Prize given to, and I forget the name of the two scholars, but it was like in the early 20th century for like the discovery of the nervous system as we understand it. So it's a relatively new discovery just in the world of Western medicine.
Right.
And
so that would make sense that it's a new discovery in the world.
It's a new discovery in the world. And one thing that became very popular sort of with that new discovery is this disease of neurasthenia, which is a very old-fashioned disease that we don't talk about, but that was extremely popular in Japan and East Asia throughout the early 20th century. This is also a disease before we had like the disease of our modern psychiatric diseases like depression.
So what would you say neurasthenia is? What is it that they were looking at, in terms of someone coming into their clinic?
Well, neurasthenia could be some things we call depression today. Probably it's going to be, how's it going to present? Insomnia would be part of it. Just a lot of anxiousness. Other things that were very popular diseases at the time, like loss of semen, spermatorrhea, these other diseases of sort of just general weakness. And it was thought to be a disease of modern societies too, where like the pace of life seems to be quickening.
I mean, not unlike in our day, we call it stress.
Yeah, a lot like stress. Yes. Yeah.
Whatever that actually means, because people come in, they've got all kinds of stuff going on. It could be anything from a shoulder, tight computer shoulders to headaches to anxiety, all the things that they prescribe things like Prozac for.
Yeah, yes.
Right?
And neurasthenia was sort of the disease of, it was almost an elite thing even. Emil Durkheim called it, I think, the disease of the upper class or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, farmers don't have no time for that stuff.
That's right. Yeah, farmers, they just got to get to work. But that was a very popular, a new diagnosis that was coming to China. And so some of these doctors in the early 20th century who were like speculating that the liver is a way of thinking about the nervous system are also trying to think, how do we treat neurasthenia? And that became like if you make that equation that the liver and the nervous system are related, then you've got like a link. Then you've got a way. Okay, so maybe it's liver qi stagnation. And so you can actually find cases from some of these. It's a kind of a special set of doctors. It's not like, I don't think it's necessarily every doctor from this period who are arguing that this idea of the nervous system helps us to better understand what the liver does and to better understand liver qi constraint. And now that we have this way of thinking about it, we also have treatments for it. And it could be things like rambling powder, but other things, but treatments that go to the liver in particular.
So back in this Republican era, I know a little bit of the history. I don't know a lot. I know a little. First of all, there was the overthrow of the Qing dynasty. The Republicans come in. It's not exactly a smooth transition, right?
That's correct.
Communists kind of show up. World War II intervenes. I mean, pretty messy there for the first 45, 50 years of the century.
Yes, absolutely.
And in the midst of all that, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, right? They're even trying to outlaw things like Chinese medicine. They're saying this is superstition. We got to get rid of it. And then there's a big backlash from Chinese doctors. Mm-hmm. So there's tons of stuff going on here. And also, like you said, there's these influences of Western thinking coming in, and not just Western thinking, but the newest ideas in Western thinking. Like you're saying, hey, look, there's a nervous system. Not too unlike these days. I go, look, there's inflammation everywhere. It's suddenly kind of the thing that a lot of thought centers around.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So how is it that liver qi constraint came to be such a garden variety diagnosis?
Good question. I think, I think some of these Republican doctors were part of that, even though today we would no longer, you would be laughed at probably for saying that the liver is analogous to the nervous system. But I think they helped us to think about treatments for neurasthenia. Neurasthenia definitely stuck around in China for a long time. In fact, even when I was a student in the late 90s, that was the beginning of I think Prozac was coming into China kind of in the very late 90s. But I saw a doctor still diagnosing neurasthenia. I'm thinking it would be diagnosed less and less today. And in fact, it's no longer, it's not in the DSM. It's no longer considered an appropriate biomedical diagnosis. It fell out of favor a long time ago, but it stuck around in China for a long time. So I think it became, that diagnosis was, and I've hesitated to make some generalizations, but that was a pretty powerful diagnosis in a society where it was a little bit difficult to speak about mental illness. And of course, there's a lot of treatments for all kinds of mental illness in Chinese medicine, but the biomedical kind of way of thinking about it wasn't too developed. And so neurasthenia, I think, had this very long life in China. And I think that helped solidify this idea of liver qi constraint as being one way, certainly not the only way, but one important way of dealing with all kinds of emotional issues.
Yeah. So I've heard this said that, and this is a generalization, so take it with a big old shovel of salt, that Chinese culture, traditionally speaking, tends to somaticize emotions, whereas here in the West, we tend to psychologize our physical experience.
I think that might come from Arthur Kleinman, who's a medical anthropologist who's done a lot of work in China. Yeah, I mean, I think that we want to be careful about those divides because they're potentially misleading in a lot of ways. But
again, general screen of sorts.
But I think that's true. I mean, even in my own clinical practice here in the U.S., I have to kind of constantly explain to patients like the anxiety or depression or whatever. Those are things we can work on. Like, we approach those things through the body in Chinese medicine. Folks, I think, in the West are not used to thinking that way because we probably tend to psychologize. We tend to have this mind-body divide, and we don't, and patients don't see those possibilities. Whereas I think certainly in Chinese medicine, it was the mind was never separate from the body. And as I'm sure all your listeners know, there isn't much of a mind, theoretically speaking, in Chinese medicine. So we always go through the body. So I think classically there's some truth to that. Although I'm sure we can find. As soon as I say that, somebody will point out lots of counterexamples. But
well, I mean, this is the thing about Chinese medicine, right? There's always counterexamples.
Yeah.
There's usually more than one right way to look at something, and those right ways often are contradictory.
That's right, and and with this issue of constraint too, and that's why I think it'd be great for your listeners to look at all four of those papers that we published, because constraint often involves emotional issues, although that's something that emerges slowly over time in China. But if you compare sort of Korea, Japan, and then China, maybe at its and there's other countries too at its various time periods, you see a real evolution of the way constraint is dealt with. One thing I remember that was really interesting from our research, I think my Japanese colleague Keiko Daidiji was really interested in a Japanese scholar who used a formula called Fenshi Qi, which literally translates as the drink that separates heart qi. That's probably a terrible translation. I don't know what.
Say that again?
Divide the heart, qi yin. Fenshi qi yin. So splitting the heart qi drink.
Okay.
That can't be a correct translation. And it's actually a formula that I feel like I don't really understand very well. But if you look at the formula, it has nothing to do with liver qi stagnation at all. But this was sort of, it's an old Song dynasty formula that's mostly fallen out of favor in China. It's not terribly important, but it deals with the lungs and perhaps the middle burner a little bit. And I think it's a formula that, if I remember correctly, it's sort of a combination of gui pi tang, so the cinnamon twig decoction, and wu pi san, the five
peels.
5 peels powder, which is about edema and swelling and qi deficiency, if I remember correctly. That's clearly like a very different understanding of constraint, and a very different way of thinking of how constraint might relate to emotional conditions. And that was a very popular formula for this one Japanese scholar that my colleague was looking at.
This episode is brought to you by Jane, the clinic management software that I use to keep my practice running smoothly. So let's talk about something that can be a little bit uncomfortable: raising your fees. I know, this is something that might feel awkward, but it doesn't have to. With a bit of planning and care, you can handle it in a way that feels right for you and your patients. One tip, give yourself at least 2 months to prepare. This gives you time to get comfortable with the change and let your patients know what's happening. You can share the news through emails, booking reminders, or even just a friendly little sign in your clinic, and avoid over-apologizing. Instead, keep it straightforward and matter of fact. Keeping things consistent across the ways that you communicate can really help avoid confusion. Fee increases aren't always easy, but you're not on your own here. For more tips and ideas on how to communicate these changes with confidence, check out frontdesk.chain.app and look for the article, How to Tell Your Clients You're Raising Your Fees. Oh, and one last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, use the code CHIALOGICAL for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. I will look that up, or you could send it to me.
Yes.
I'm going to put that in the show notes page.
Okay.
So that people can check that particular prescription out, so they can get a sense of what we're talking about here. Sometimes it's so much easier if you can just look at the herbs in a formula.
Yes.
You know a whole lot about what you're looking at.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
The
For sure.
blueprint of an illness is right inside of it.
For sure. But it's not liver qi stagnation. That's for sure.
Yeah. So can you take us on a short tour from Judanshi and the Yejuan to Xiaoyaosan and some of the different ways that constraint has been seen and worked with through your both clinical and anthropological lens?
I'll do my best. And actually, this is probably where Volker's paper is going to be, Volker's science paper is going to be helpful. But but Yejuan, is a formula developed by Judanshi. So this 15th century scholar, doctor, now kind of considered one of the four great masters of the Jin and Yuan period. Supposedly, it treats 6 different types of stagnation. There's been a lot of debate about that formula, and later scholars have argued, for example, that it's maybe a little bit more of it is both clinically useful, but it's also sort of an overview of the different types of constraint you can encounter in your practice, and you should modify that formula as needed. But something that definitely goes a little bit more to it's got Cangzhu in it, attractilities, and so it's something that goes a little bit more to the middle burner, and it's thinking of sort of some sort of impediment, some sort of obstacle to the qi mechanism, to the qi ji, the sort of up and down movements of qi in the body. So the idea of the liver is definitely quite secondary. Xiaoyaosan, and I'm going to be a little rough on the history here too, is a formula that is originally kind of a gynecological formula. It's not really used primarily in gynecology for many centuries, and in the late imperial period, and I'm going to forget who could be Zhao Shanke, I think, if I'm right. Some late imperial scholars start saying this is something that we can use in general for men and women. Some of the emotional ideas are start becoming more important there. But that's something that's really quite different than Yejuan and what Judanshi was talking about. And then I would say it's really in the Republican period that this idea of liver qi constraint really kind of becomes extremely important, and this way for the quintessential way for dealing with emotional issues. And of course, and if when you study about liver qi constraint, one confusing thing is that we know that anger is the emotion that's related to the liver. But with Xiaoyaosan and liver qi constraint, we think of it as sort of treating all emotions too. So whether it's stress or depression or anxiety, and so that becomes sort of the first formula we go to, and that itself may be a bit of a problem.
Well, given what we were talking about earlier with neurasthenia, and how in some ways it's a little bit like, I'm using air quotes here, stress.
Yeah.
We're using it in the same way. We're thinking about it as if it were neurasthenia. We're thinking about it as this overall thing about life. If you're not just a farmer eking out a living, you got time to actually be concerned about your emotions. And back then they were looking at it and going, oh yeah, well, there's this nervous system thing that we've just discovered. And one of the things to me about Chinese medicine that's fascinating, and you've got a deeper view of this than I do, so please correct me if I stray too far out of the boundaries here. But it seems like Chinese medicine has been very good at looking at things, looking at nature, looking at how things unfold, being able to notice change and the pace and rate of change. And when new ideas come in, one of the first things they do is they snap up on it and go, all right, how's this fit in with everything else that we know?
Mm-hmm.
And, it's a little bit like the Borg, right? Something new comes in, it goes, all right, we're going to grab this and add it. We're going to use your uniqueness and add it to our collective.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly, I think that the way we use Xiaoyao-san for stress really comes out of that early 20th century kind of moment. I think we want to expand our clinical repertoire, because there's other things that I think we need to be thinking about. And constraint is, and one of the things we wanted to show in this project too, is that constraint is this really complicated idea that has so many permutations and different presentations, so that we want to recognize that it's that we may have a limited view of it. But I think you're right. This idea of stress, which is, again, it's the most nondescript sort of term out there. I don't know what it means clinically, but it becomes a kind of catch-all, I think, a little bit like neurasthenia did. And so our first thought, it goes right to Xiaoyao-san and liver qi constraint. And that also, I think, misses the point a little bit about some of the Republican era doctors who were thinking about the liver and the nervous system together. And as I remember correctly, when I was looking at some of their cases, I don't think I ever saw Xiaoyao-san in any of their clinical cases per se, although they were thinking about the liver in different ways and had different kind of herbs for treating the liver, but it wasn't necessarily about, it might be more of a liver kidney double deficiency or something like that they were trying to treat. So they also, there was a richness, I think, also to their own innovations too, that's also been lost too, and in kind of its aftermath. And their writings have kind of, even in China, that's mostly forgotten. And when I tell some of my classmates or friends in China about, oh, you should have seen what Liu Yanlei or Yun Tie Chao said about the liver, they're shocked. They have no idea that anyone would ever say anything like that.
Can you give us an example of this?
Yun Tie Chao, I think, is a good example. He's got a book. Yun Tie Chao is so for your listeners, is one of the most well regarded and most famous doctors from that Republican period. He, if I believe correctly, died in maybe 1935 or so. And he's somebody who came late to Chinese medicine. He was in the world of literature and the publishing world for a while. One of the kind of the most interesting thinkers out there. And he developed his and this was very common in the Republican period. He developed his own school. He had a correspondence school. Other kind of leading doctors of the time were developing private schools at that time. And then before that, of course, sort of the master disciple model is the primary way of learning Chinese medicine. But that still goes on in the Republican period. But sort of experiments with school are first starting. And so Yun Tie Chao develops his own correspondence school, and therefore writes a whole series of textbooks about them. And one of them is a textbook on the pulse. And he has a very interesting explanation for like a wiry pulse, xuan mai. And he argues that the reason we have a wiry pulse and that's connected to the liver is because we have like tension. This is again through the nervous system, tension in the walls of the arteries caused by whatever, but it's that physical tension in the walls of the artery that explains the xuan mai. So again, he kind of uses this idea of the liver is analogous to like the nervous system to explain how to the pulse we're feeling, and that's right in his textbook.
Yeah.
Say
his name again.
Yun Tie Chao. So to spell that would be Y-U-N.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And then T-I-E.
T-I-E.
Q-I-A-O.
Chao. Okay. Yun Tie Chao.
He's one of my favorites.
What else did he have to say about constraints?
He more or less agreed with this idea that about the nervous system and the liver. Let me give you another example, because Yun Tie Chao has a lot to say about a lot of things, and I can kind of sum up a little bit what some of these folks say in a second. But I'll give you another example from another famous doctor named Zhu Weiju.
Zhu
Weiju. So the last name is Zhu, which is C-H-U.
Yeah.
Then
Wei, W-E-I, Zhu.
And then J-U. Zhu Weiju, very famous clinician from this time. And if I remember correctly, he argues that, I don't have the passions in front of me, but it's in the paper. He said Chinese medicine didn't have a notion of the nervous system at all, but it turns out that all discussions of qi are like a pretty good approximation of it. And he says something to the effect that that liver, then he expands it a little bit. He says liver qi and heart qi issues are all about the nervous system. And then I think he says anything related to heart qi is the involuntary nervous system. Anything related to liver qi is the voluntary nervous system. And so he divides it up that way.
That's interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah. And I should say a little bit more about these doctors too, because actually some of these speculations about the way the body of Western medicine and the body of Chinese medicine connects, like goes together with some other parts of the way they thought about Chinese medicine, which is really important. So a lot of the doctors who are making this same kind of connection between the liver and the nervous system were also deeply involved in like some debates that are also very much forgotten from this time period. And one of them is the debate between the cold damage tradition and the warm illness or the warm disorder. I like to call it the warm disorder tradition. Mm-hmm. So your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the Shanghan Lun, the treatise on cold damage disorder.
How could we not be?
Yes. And you probably also learned about warm illness, Wenbing, in your
Wenbing Tiao. Mm-hmm.
And the warm illness school or the warm disorder school is a development of the late imperial period, but particularly the Qing dynasty and especially the 19th century. And one of the things that these doctors absolutely hated. So this would be doctors that include Lu Yuanlei, Zhu Weiju, Yun Tiechao, those last two I just mentioned, but a whole number of other ones who are very interested in sort of this, who are sometimes lumped into that convergence school. But one of the things they absolutely detested was the warm illness school. And they just thought that was like a travesty. They thought that was just a complete bastardization of Chinese medicine and folks just like losing the way. So their ideas about the body go together with some other, these like really intense debates at the time. And another thing that's kind of part of it too is also, that's also important to understand is, I think one reason they felt at liberty to sort of make these connections between, like, say, the liver and the nervous system, whereas today we would be scolded by all of our teachers for doing that, is also Western medicine is a very different thing too in the Republican period. So not only do you have like diseases like neurasthenia coming to China, but Western medicine isn't like this clinically dominant form of medical practice that it is today. So for these doctors, most of them thought that Chinese medicine was clinically much more efficacious than Western medicine. And this I talk about a little bit in this other paper, Slow Medicine. They were often very involved in treating all kinds of acute diseases because there weren't antibiotics or other Western medicine solutions for these problems. Their views on the body are part of this really comprehensive, very complicated way of understanding Chinese medicine that in some ways was also, at the same time that they were trying to like bring in pieces of Western medicine, they're also trying to get back to like the Shanghan Lun in like the early Han Dynasty and sort of what they think of as true Chinese medicine, which is kind of like emerges in the Han Dynasty. And they mostly think that anything that happened after the Song Dynasty was just garbage, to put it bluntly.
You know what's really hilarious to me? We have the same stuff going on today, right? Mm-hmm. There's the people that say, oh, modern TCM, well, that's a bunch of BS.
Yeah.
Some imperial formulary. Yeah, right. Government intervention, blah, blah, blah. We got to get back to basics. I mean, throughout the history,
yes,
there have been doctors arguing about, we got to get back to basics. This new stuff, I don't know, right? Or this school over here. I mean, I love Unschold's translation of the Nanjing because it's got all these great commentaries in it. The commentaries are fantastic because you've got doctors commenting not just on the text, but commenting on other commentaries through decades. And you'll see some really inflammatory stuff like, oh, you treat your patient this way, they will die. It will be your fault.
That was exactly the language of the Republican period. When formulas were like literally the kiss of death. That was a guaranteed way to kill your patients if you took that approach, according to these. Right. And vice versa. The Wenbing folks thought that Shanghan formulas were much too powerful. They would overwhelm sort of like more delicate constitutions, particularly in the south of China, where people thought to be a little bit more delicate.
Oh yes, well, they were more delicate and more cultured, right?
And more cultured,
rough and tumble, Northerners.
That's right. There's a famous book by Marta Hansen. If any folks are interested in this debate a little bit, that's a whole history of the warm illness school, and she really talks about robust Northerners and delicate Southerners.
Oh, great! Yeah, we'll put that on the show notes too.
So, but yeah, I think that one important piece of the story, and it's not really fully elaborated in the article that I wrote. It's a little bit there, but I think it's something that I was sort of discovering at the time, is that some of these other influences, these other debates, the influence from Japan also is very important for these doctors. I don't think I think I mentioned that in the article, but I think that's something even more important than I realized at the time. Well, so first, Japan is so as you mentioned, this is the early 20th century is a time of political weakness in China. The Qing dynasty is overthrown in 1911, but it was already sort of teetering for really since 1895, when Japan defeated China in what do we call that war? I think maybe it's the first Sino-Japanese War, but it was a battle that was fought in Korea, really for control of Korea in some sense, or at least for control of sort of political influence in Korea. And Japan is growing quickly, becoming a military power in the early 20th century. It's colonizing parts of China, just like European powers are as well. It eventually takes over Korea, then moves into Manchuria in 1931 and sets up a puppet government there. And of course, later there's the war with Japan, the Second War, which is 1937, and kind of the beginning of World War II, at least in China. But Chinese scholars are relatively unaware of sort of what's going on in the rest of East Asia, Korea, and Japan in terms of medical scholarship. It's mostly, I mean, that's again a little bit of a simplification, but it's mostly a one-way street for many centuries. Ideas from China make their way to Korea and Japan, and they don't really come back. And that starts to change in the early 20th century, and it's really in part because of the rise of Japan as a military power, but also as a cultural center too, because Japan is modernizing very quickly. So you have Chinese intellectuals in the early 20th century going to Japan to study, bringing back lots of ideas of about sort of Western knowledge, Western sciences and humanities with them. But eventually also some of the ideas of Japanese Kampo medicine come back as well. And so some of these folks that I'm writing about in the 1920s are sort of discovering Japanese scholarship, and they're kind of delighted by what they discover. It's really original. It's very different. It's a very different approach to clinical practice. So that's also part of the mix. A little bit less. I think a little bit less in terms of this relationship with like the liver and the nervous system. I don't know if that really I don't know if there's a direct Japanese inspiration there, but definitely sort of about debates about like warm illness and cold damage. That's very influential in there, because it turns out there's incredible Japanese scholarship on the treaties of cold damage. It's also very different than what's been happening in China.
Well, I mean, Kampo medicine, Hanfang.
Yeah.
I mean, that really comes from the Shanghanlun.
So that comes from the Shanghanlun. And so I think that's becoming now a little bit more popular here in the US and certainly in China too. And that sort of way of thinking about the treaties of cold damage also is influencing some of these Republican era scholars as well.
Imagine this. A patient walks into your clinic. They're carrying more than the pain in their body. There's a story there, a history woven with the stress of long days, the ache of things unsaid, and the quiet longing for something to shift. You listen, not just with your ears, but with your hands, your intuition, your heart. It's not just about needles or a formula. It's about connection, understanding the threads that tie us together, mind, body, and spirit. That is where golden flower Chinese herbs comes in. Rooted in tradition and crafted with care, their formulas are more than herbs. They're a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern practice. Every bottle, a quiet partner in your work, helping you to meet your patients where they are. Because healing isn't just about treating symptoms. It's about creating trust, cultivating belonging, and helping someone feel truly seen. Golden flower Chinese herbs, your partner in practice and connection, where tradition meets care. Now, as I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I remember reading the article, but it's been a couple of weeks now. It sounds like a lot of these Western medicine ideas, like you were saying, they started to trickle in because people were going to places like Japan, and they were getting exposure for
Mm-hmm.
these ideas. And then, they bring them back. And again, Chinese medicine being what it is, how do we incorporate this into the way that we already think about it? Like you said, there wasn't a whole lot of Western medicine
Mm-hmm.
in China at the time. And in fact, if you had an acute illness, you didn't go to a Western doctor. That would be a bad idea. This was before antibiotics and steroids and such.
Right.
You went to those Republican era Chinese doctors that actually knew how to treat this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so that was, and this gets into this other paper, how Chinese medicine became efficacious only for chronic illnesses. But I interviewed a number of very elderly doctors who had kind of trained and practiced in the Republican period. They're all sort of in their 80s and 90s. And some of these interviews were 8-9 years ago. A few of them are a little bit more recent, but they all said the same thing. There was like, in my village, certainly in the countryside, there was essentially no Western medicine, or if there was, it might be like somebody with the skill level of maybe like a nurse or something, maybe a nurse practitioner, like in a county seat. And then even in the cities, there was missionary hospitals and there was some private practitioners of Western medicine, but they may be very expensive. Missionary hospitals certainly had a number of patients, but in general, folks sought out Chinese medicine practitioners. And so one of the things that stunned me in those interviews was that, sort of asking them, so what did you treat? And, it was things like, well, cholera. So there was a smallpox epidemic in 1946. Bubonic plague was big. And at first I thought they were just like, trying to pull one over on me or something. I'd learned very clearly in my clinical practice that if we saw any infections that we're pretty much going to use antibiotics. But they all said the same thing. And they all said, if you're going to make it as a Chinese medicine doctor, you better make it treating acute, and then in this case, mostly infectious diseases, because that's, that was the big thing.
Yeah. It's so different from how
Yeah.
we think about it now. We can, that's a whole different podcast. So
Yeah,
we'll just leave that kettle of fish for a moment. With all this background that you've got, all this anthropological study, plus you've got clinical work, I'm curious to know how all of this looks for you in your current practice when you're seeing patients. If you have someone coming in with something that looks like, well, what most of us would think of as liver-qi constraint, are there other ways that your mind is working and perhaps other formulations that you lean on for this, I'm going to say, neurasthenia, stress complex of oddball symptoms?
Yeah, I mean, I think I try to at least not jump to that, and I think I think we all learn this, but I think when we start to make those equivalences, like rambling powder is good for stress, we start forgetting about the Chinese medicine indications. I try to stay within sort of the Chinese medicine system as best I can, but I think also, at least for me, we've had this discussion a little bit by email. At least some of this research that I think opens me up to at least thinking differently a little bit about what I've, the sort of basic textbooks knowledge that we've learned, and to go back and look at something like Ye Juan, which frankly I don't use that much in my practice, but I certainly understand it very differently now than I would have. And if I did have occasion to use it, I think be trying to think about it more in its kind of historical moment than and then as a sort of like a treatment for liver-qi constraint.
Mm-hmm. So maybe if there's more middle burner indications, or I remember you saying earlier in our conversation today, there's 5 or 6 different constraints in there. You can kind of look at it and go, well, it works on these various levels of constraint, take it as a blueprint, modify it based on what you actually see.
I think that's certainly one lesson. And I mean, another lesson from all the Republican doctors is that I look at is that there's so much more diversity of thought out there in the world of Chinese medicine than we realize. I sometimes don't like the critique of TCM. We can talk about that in a second. But at the same time, we need to always kind of recognize just, what we've learned is sort of the tip of the iceberg. If we can kind of get back into some other writings and really dig into some of these formulas that we use in our clinical practice, we might discover other aspects of it that we just didn't appreciate, the first time around.
Yeah.
I had a few thoughts actually on this idea of like TCM and textbooks and things like that if you want
Yeah,
to
let's
kind
hear
of go
about
that
it.
route. Yeah. Because I studied in China, I'm a little bit disconnected from like the world of Chinese medicine here. So I don't totally, but as my understanding, sort of TCM is almost a dirty word in the Chinese medicine community, and everyone wants to get back to classical Chinese. Is that right?
Well,
Classical
I
Chinese
don't know
medicine.
about everybody. Here's what I've discovered. TCM, this is just me, right? My opinion. I'm on a soapbox. Actually, I'm not on a soapbox, but I got a soapbox. It's called Geological. Anyway,
Uh,
we all learn TCM. TCM gives us a common language. It gives us some ways of parsing reality. It gives us some ways of understanding physiology from another point of view. And what I discovered is it gave me a basic language. So when I ended up in Taiwan and China, I could talk to Chinese doctors and they would understand what I was saying. I could ask them questions that made sense to them. They would give me back answers that I could understand. Sometimes that was within the fond way of TCM. Sometimes that was other ideas that they had that they got from a family tradition or their own experience or wherever. But the bottom line is we had a common language to communicate with. So I know TCM gets a lot of bad play. I don't know how much it is that TCM is bad stuff and how much of it is, much like the Menghe doctors, right? Back in the day, it's like, well, I'm a Menghe doctor, right? I'm not like that, McDonald's like doctor down the street. I think human beings forever have been setting themselves as, well, my stuff is different than that stuff. And here's how, and here's why it's important. So do business with me.
Yeah.
Some of it I think is branding.
Yeah.
Some of it I think is just human beings saying, I got something different. I guess I'm just grateful to it in a way because it's what got me started. It was, we'll hear your opinion here in a moment, but it just seems to me that TCM was an attempt at a certain moment in time to try to keep the population of a giant teetering country healthy. And they actually pulled from the brilliance of a number of different people. Not that there's only TCM, but it's not a bad sort of a Reader's Digest version of Chinese medicine.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think now I think I sense sort of maybe one frustration here in the U.S. is that perhaps people take, and I think TCM kind of refers to probably textbook medicine, and folks are getting their textbooks and getting sort of the Chinese medicine textbooks in translation more or less here in the U.S. But when that's taken as sort of like the beginning and the end and all there is in Chinese medicine, maybe some people reject it because then they're like, oh, there's more. And I think the more is always apparent in China. Everyone knows the textbooks are just your starting point. It's definitely not where you're going to end. But there also, it is, I think it not only does it give you a common language, but it also kind of served a lot of really important functions. What we have all benefited from, which is it helped to establish sort of the institutions of Chinese medicine, literally the school I went to, but also the hospitals where I trained at. So it was part of kind of an institutionalization of Chinese medicine that took place in the 1950s. And part of what happened too was there was an attempt to, I think this is both its strength and its weakness, is that it was a compromise. So it had to be sort of general knowledge that most everyone could agree on. There was a whole set of doctors that were pulled together to write the textbooks. So it had to be sort of common knowledge that everyone could more or less agree on it. But it was this idea of consensus was really behind it. So things like I just mentioned, like debates between like the cold damage school and the warm illness school, like that had to go away. And in the textbooks. And also I think another thing happens too, which is that in the really beginning of the 1950s and certainly by the 60s and 70s is that Western medicine is changing profoundly. It's clinically becoming a much more efficacious form of medicine. It's becoming sort of the dominant medicine in the world. And it's also become the dominant medicine in China. The Communist Party is really behind not only the institution of Chinese medicine, but even more so the institutionalization of Western medicine. So Chinese medicine the profession as a whole starts to rethink, like, who are we, like, vis-a-vis Western medicine? And that's a very different kind of way of thinking about Chinese medicine than in the Republican period. So that's why it was totally fine for Yun Tiechao or Liu Yanlei or Chu Weiju or any of those doctors to say, yeah, the liver is a really great way of thinking about the nervous system, because they weren't particularly threatened by the profession of Western medicine, which is like there was very few doctors of it in China at the time. And it was just like this other body of knowledge that seemed really useful to borrow from. Whereas in the communist era, Western medicine is a real challenge to the practice of Chinese medicine. And so textbooks have to be written in kind of in light of that challenge, although they're very careful to sort of never acknowledge that, to never like state that. But Western medicine really can't be part of Chinese medicine textbooks. Chinese medicine textbooks have to then highlight the characteristics of Chinese medicine, but the characteristics really increasingly kind of vis-a-vis Western medicine. And so it must be sort of in this complicated relationship. It's got to be different, but not too different. It's, and so that's part of what happens with Western medicine. And if you just take this idea of like liver qi constraint, some of the ideas from the Republican era doctors make their way into the textbooks, but they don't make it with the same explanation. Hey, the liver is just like the nervous system. That would be, totally verboten. You can't make that analogy, but the treatments, the idea that liver qi constraint treats all kinds of emotional disorders do make it into the textbooks. And in the paper I wrote, I sort of trace that, like you can see the early editions of the textbooks, very much carry on sort of some of that thinking from these Republican era innovators, but they put it in this form that's maybe very textbooky for the lack of a better word, but it's this kind of consensus driven sort of series of documents and texts. And I think that's just like one small example. So, but a lot of things are coming in, and they're not going to throw out warm illness because not everyone can agree to throw it out, and they're not going to throw out, certainly not going to, and they're not going to have maybe this different notion of cold damage because not everyone can agree on that. So it has to be like whatever goes into the textbook had to be things that more or less everyone can kind of agree on. And so that, and even actually the cold damage is another example. Some of these same scholars who are talking about liver qi constraint in the Republican period are also like proposing like radical reinterpretations of like the treatise on cold damage disorders. And, none of that carries on in the communist era because it was just too radical. And so textbooks are these consensus documents. That's part of the frustration is because we don't know how to read them. We don't know we can't quite see that. They're just taught to us and given to us as sort of like, this is it. This is the way Chinese medicine has always been.
Here's the complete medicine.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
In fact, it's kind of like the table of contents of medicine.
Yeah.
And we've got to go in and dig the rest of it out on our own. It helps if you read some Chinese.
Yeah. So there's so many examples of this, and we have a hard time kind of looking at those textbooks critically. And I think also perhaps for practitioners in the West, a hard time to even know that there's so much beyond what's in the textbooks. And I think that's where people kind of then reject them as TCM, as some sort of perversion of Chinese medicine. I think that's not giving the textbooks enough credit because they really enabled kind of this institution to persist and flourish, even though it was, again, more of a consensus form of medicine and really perhaps not the way anyone would actually practice medicine.
It's sort of like the top of the bell curve, right? You get the average of something, but you see very few people that are actually average.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, I mean, as I listen to you explain this, the pressures that were brought to bear on the country, on the medicine, as things move through time, it's impossible to escape the influence of our times. And, it's lovely having this conversation with you today, getting this glimpse of early Republican China, what the medicine looked like, where some of their ideas came from. And then we look at the pressures that were brought to bear for TCM. I remember when I was in school, my teacher said, there are some patterns here. This is to help guide your thinking. These are boxes. And there are things that we see out there. Don't put your patients in a box. Understand the mechanisms behind what creates these boxes. Pay attention to those mechanisms. And I think one of the problems with, air quotes again, TCM, we expect to see these, boxes. And when they don't show up, it's like, well, what's that? Or, oh, well, this is not effective. Well, we need to actually understand the pathodynamic that's going on, which I think the books are like exercises in thinking. If we can learn to understand that stuff, then we can take those principles and apply them in all kinds of ways. And you could sit down in the same room with a Wenbing person and a Shanghanlun person and, enjoy some whiskey together, because you probably got more commonality than differences when you get down to that level.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, and hopefully you would find the commonalities. Now, even the word pattern that you just mentioned, I would also argue that's Bianjung-Lunge, which we think of as our key methodology, pattern discrimination and treatment determination. It's a term that doesn't appear until the late 1950s. So it's really.
Now you just opened a whole new can of worms here.
Yep. It is really an invention of the textbooks themselves. So yeah, that's a whole nother. That's the next podcast, maybe.
That really is food for another conversation. I think we're going to have to put a bookmark in it for today, though. But we can certainly pick that up another time. Before we sign off, I'm just curious to know, in addition to all the writing you're doing, the practice you're doing, I mean, what do you got going on? I mean, it sounds like you have your finger in a number of pies these days. So what's your day look like?
It's a bit hectic, but yeah. So I'm busy teaching, and I have my clinical practice, which I have to balance with my teaching schedule, and I'm also a founding member of a new company called Dao Labs. So we've been working on developing at the moment mostly just classical formulas, but trying to help popularize them a little bit with consumers and work with practitioners to sell those formulas. One thing we've been doing is to try and flavor them so that maybe people will be a little bit more excited about taking them. But anyway, yeah, I've got my fingers in a couple of pies.
Are you saying you've got a cherry flavored ume wine?
Well, we have now I'm going to forget the different flavors. But well, for example, we're working on dual Huoji Shengtang, which is one of my favorite formulas, and we're trying to make a sort of a Mexican chocolate sort of beverage out of it. But if it works, I think it's great, because then one of the hard parts for me always is getting my patients to take the medicine, and so if we can come up with some ways that are a little bit more innovative and make it a little bit more appealing, I think that'll be great for everyone.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for taking the time today. I thoroughly enjoyed your articles. We will have those up over on the show notes page. So y'all listening to this right now, you can go check those out. They take an evening to read. They take a little bit of thought, and it will broaden your perspective in some really delightful ways. I think you'll like them. So look for those. Any other items that we've talked about of interest, you'll find some stuff there on the show notes. Eric, thank you so much for your time today.
Michael, it's a pleasure. Always fun to get to talk about my research. So anytime, love to talk about some more of it.
Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological, or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Qiological.